What I found buried in a leaked blind thread this week was the same 4 words, typed over and over by different people, under 2 numbers. 91% of the people responding said they hated Amazon's new 5-day mandate. 73% said they were weighing whether to quit. And underneath all of it, over and over, this is a backdoor layoff. Here's the question I actually want to answer. Is return to office a clever way to cut headcount without paying severance for it? Or are we giving a company's guesswork credit for a plan that was never there? Those are very different problems to have. If the backdoor layoff read is right, anyone staring down a mandate like this needs to understand the game being run on them. If it's wrong, the real explanation is stranger, and worse for the people stuck living inside it. Required office days went up 12% nationwide between 2024 and 2025, so this isn't a story from 2023. It's landing in somebody's inbox this week. Let's start with the case for the meme, because it held up better than I expected going in. A quarter of C-suite executives admitted they hoped a return-to-office policy would make people quit. So did nearly 1 in 5 HR leaders. I didn't pull that number from a recap tweet. I went and read the actual Bamboo HR survey, because recap tweets round up, and I wanted to know exactly how big this secret motive really was. It's a smaller document than the discourse built on top of it. Nearly 40% of managers went further, saying their company ended up running formal layoffs anyway, because not enough people quit on their own. That's its own quiet admission. The voluntary plan doesn't reliably work, even when someone upstairs is counting on it. And the mechanism has real teeth. Legally, if you quit because of a mandate, your employer doesn't owe you severance. It doesn't have to give the 60-day layoff notice the law requires for an actual layoff either. Only a formal termination triggers any of that. Quit on your own, and you get nothing. No check, no notice period, nothing to plan around. The system built an off-ramp with no toll booth on it, and every company driving through gets to call that a coincidence. You can watch the mechanism work in the open. In 2023, AT&T told about 60,000 managers they had 2 weeks to relocate to one of 9 hub cities or lose their jobs. No relocation help, even for people who'd been remote for a decade. Employees told reporters it was, in their own words, a layoff wearing return-to-office sheep's clothing. And yet, only 8% of companies raising in-office requirements will actually admit, on the record, that the goal is to push people out. 8%. If you've ever assumed every RTO memo has a spreadsheet quietly running your severance against your salary, you've been crediting HR with a lot more coordinated malice than 8% of them can apparently muster. That's the surface case. Real, documented, occasionally as blunt as a 2-week relocation notice, and still a minority position wearing a majority-sized reputation. It tells you the intent exists somewhere in the building. It doesn't tell you whether the plan works, and that's the question that actually matters. But some executives want this, and this is a functioning cost-cutting strategy. Turned out to be 2 very different claims. When I went looking for proof of the second one, that this actually saves anybody money, the numbers stopped cooperating entirely. Researchers tracked 137 S&P 500 companies that forced everyone back 5 days a week. Their stock price and their profits didn't improve at all. 99% of those companies watched employee satisfaction drop for the trouble. I tried building the spreadsheet a CFO would actually need to make this pencil out as a savings play. Severance avoided against slower hiring, a thinner bench, and a policy nobody's fully following. I have built worse spreadsheets for weaker reasons than this one. This one still wouldn't close. Nationwide, required office days rose 12% between 2024 and 2025. Actual attendance rose 1 to 3%. Almost nobody's actually complying. If your building quietly stopped checking badge swipes on Fridays sometime last year, you already know what hushed hybrid means before I define it. Managers look the other way for anyone still performing, because enforcing the policy costs them more than the policy was ever supposed to save. A mandate that isn't even being enforced can't be the disciplined cost play the meme describes. You cannot dodge severance by pushing out employees who simply didn't come in on Tuesdays, and nobody said a word about it. 83% of business leaders admit their own return-to-office policy has already cost them talent they didn't want to lose, which is a strange thing to keep doing on purpose. In January, Home Depot cut about 800 corporate jobs, roughly 150 of them at its Atlanta headquarters. Severance, transitional benefits, and job placement support came with it. A real, disclosed, paid layoff. Then, separately, it told whoever was left they needed to be in 5 days a week. That's the actual current pattern, the paid layoff and the mandate, back to back, nearly the opposite of what the meme promises. And the tool doesn't only get pulled for cost. At Grindr, a union drive started, and within Within weeks, employees were told to relocate to a hub city in 2 weeks or leave. Roughly half the company chose to leave. Labor regulators filed a retaliation complaint over it. That's not a severance dodge. That's a different weapon entirely, wearing the same return-to-office costume. Here's the stake underneath all of it. If RTO isn't reliably making anyone quit, and it isn't saving anyone money, that's not a victimless miscalculation. It's still costing companies their most skilled, hardest to replace people. And it's still costing you the flexibility you built your actual life around. The school pickup, the commute you can't afford to pay for twice, the parent you check on at lunch. Which means the real question isn't whether this is a secret layoff. It's why so many companies running a play the numbers say doesn't work. The strongest research answer isn't cost, it's control. Researchers followed 3 million tech and finance workers' careers on LinkedIn. After RTO mandates hit, the people most likely to leave were the most senior, the most skilled, and disproportionately women. Losing them isn't a rounding error. It's the org chart's future leaving through the parking garage, all at once, in 1 quarter. After those mandates, it took those same companies 23% longer to fill open jobs, while they were hiring 17% less. The professor who ran that study put it plainly. The pattern looks less like a business strategy and more like managers grabbing back control. It's about finding someone to blame when the numbers still don't move. If you've ever watched a manager reorganize the seating chart right after a bad quarter, you already understand this instinct better than any economist does. Even the Federal Reserve's own regional business survey has picked up employers describing return to office and hiring freezes as a way to encourage attrition instead of announcing layoffs outright. So this isn't a fringe theory. It's a pattern showing up in the Fed's own notes. And it isn't only a private sector instinct. After a 2025 federal mandate, a government watchdog tracking the Social Security Administration found telework hours fall from 35% to 13% in 2 months. The same hiring and retention damage rippled through afterward. Nobody there was hiding a spreadsheet. The mandate was public, announced, mandatory, and it still cost them the people they needed, which tells you the damage is the policy, not the secrecy. I went back and checked Andy Jassy's own words about Amazon's mandate. In a November all-hands, he told employees directly, "This was not a cost play for us." Then I checked that claim against Amazon's actual hiring slowdown afterward. He wasn't lying about the spreadsheet. There wasn't one to lie about. Which is almost funnier than if there had been. A company can accidentally recreate every symptom of a deliberate layoff without anyone upstairs ever running the numbers on it. Jassy called his version culture. Home Depot called its version speed and agility. At some point, culture became the load-bearing wall under every decision nobody wants to itemize out loud. Stop assuming the person who signed your mandate has a plan smarter than the one you'd guess at, sitting in traffic on your first commute back. The evidence says most of them don't. Return to office looks less like strategy and more like a reflex, dressed up afterward as culture or collaboration. Because we wanted to feel back in control doesn't fit cleanly into a company-wide email. Sure, because what every anxious, over-monitored office really needed was managers rediscovering the seating chart and calling it a strategy. You've probably sat in a meeting where someone explained the policy using the word collaboration 4 times in 90 seconds. You nodded, because what else do you do? That's worth sitting with for a second, because it changes what you're actually negotiating for. You're not negotiating against a hidden layoff. You're negotiating against somebody's need to feel like the org chart still listens to them. The company that wants you gone quietly is the minority, 8% by the honest one's own count. The company that wants to feel in charge again doesn't actually need you gone. It just needs you compliant, which is a cheaper ask and a much harder one to ever prove. If I were you, I'd stop trying to reverse engineer the hidden genius in a return to office announcement. There usually isn't one to find. Here's the one thing worth doing differently instead. When the next mandate lands, ask what it's actually costing the company to keep you unhappy, not why they supposedly want you back. That number is the more honest answer, and it's sitting in a study almost nobody in your building has actually read. That blind thread I opened with? Backdoor layoff. Typed over and over under Amazon's own numbers, turns out to be wrong about the layoff part and dead right about something bigger. Nobody upstairs had actually run the math before hitting send. The homework just never got done. 91% of people were furious at a policy that didn't even do what everyone assumed it was built to do. That's not a conspiracy. That's a company that skipped its own homework and is now grading yours. That's the memo. Read.